doing a Microsoft Visual Studio project here, just called a MVC web application. We're just going to use MVC4 for this. So what we do is we just go into Visual Studio and we're going to just do a new project. We're going to make this a C# project, and we're going to use web templates. From this middle box here, we're going to select ASP.NET MVC4 Web Application, and we're going to save it to our desktop. Okay, just for those who are not listening with audio, we select desktop and select folder. Here we're going to call this MVC4 Web Application and select OK. Now from here we have a bunch of project templates to get started. We're going to select Internet Application. Our view engine is Razor. We're not going to create any user tests, so we're just going to go with all the defaults here and click OK. Now one thing with the MVC web applications and most projects within Visual Studio is they get up and running quite fast with a lot of tools already installed. And in this case, we're going to have user authentication available using OAuth, which means that you can integrate things like Facebook, Google, LinkedIn, and any of the other OAuth-enabled applications that are out there. So now we're up and running. We have just a review of the MVC framework here. What we have is our controllers folder, and that contains our controllers classes. We have an account controller and a home controller. We have some models. We have an account model, which most likely corresponds with our account controller. In views, we have an account view set here, and this is about managing logins, membership, registration, things like that. We'll get into that later on. Our home views, about, contact, index, and we have a couple of shared views as well. Our layout is our basic layout that displays when the web page, that is the index page, loads up. I'm just going to take a look at the file called a web config. Now this file contains all of our information about the background information about our site, like what versions of libraries we're using, and as well, one very important section that we're going to be looking at today is connection strings. This particular field here is using a name called default connection, and it handles all of the information regarding our user authentication in this case. We have our data source located in local DB. That's just a local version of Microsoft SQL Server. Very simple. It doesn't have all the power of a full server application database would, but you can upgrade your database to start using it like that though. This here is our initial catalog name, and it kind of gives this big long set of information here. I don't particularly like it being so long, so we're just going to do something very simple, and we're going to call it my database, and we're also just going to copy that name and we're going to paste it over here. I'm going to just give it a new file name. Now this is the attached DB file name. It tells us that it is that the file will end up being in the app data directory or folder right here. Right now there's nothing in there, and I'll show you what that looks like. If I go to my desktop, I see my MVC4 web application folder. That's the one we just created. I go in here and I go into app data, there's nothing in there yet because we haven't done anything to create a database, but we will. Okay, so now I've got my initial catalog set, I've got my database name set. It's going to be mydatabase.mdf. That's the file that's going to be created once we run a user registration process. It's very important to run that process first, or else your database just won't create. Let's save the file here, save our web config, and we're going to close that too. We'll just close up home controller, and let's go ahead and run it for the first time. Now what you're going to see is there's a lot of great little features that are in our basic website. I think the most powerful is that we have user authentication. This is a process that took a lot of time before to get organized, and you can use the out-of-the-box tools with some sense of security that you're going to feel comfortable using it in a public website. Obviously there's some upgrades to do, but in general you have everything that you need to get started. So we're going to click on the register button here. And as I said before, once we do the registration process, it's going to create a database for us with all the necessary tables for us to get up and running with user authentication. This username here, I'm just going to use test user. I'm going to just type that in as our basic name here. And just to be easy, I'm going to just make a password called test user. I'm not going to get too complicated. And when we click register, I'll just save that just for the sake of using it later. Why not? Okay. Now, if we go over to our app data folder, you'll see that we now have a mydatabase.mdf and a mydatabase log LDF. Okay, that's a log file. It just tells what's happened during the session of using that database. Now, let's just minimize this. I'm going to close out of our web application now and stop. Okay. Now, one thing that we're going to do as well in this tutorial is upgrade to Entity Framework 6. And the reason we're going to do that is because I like using Entity Framework Power Tools. It's a little product that I've found really helpful in building models from databases that are already existing. A lot of the work I do happens to have existing databases, and it can be a little bit difficult to or time-consuming more so to build models based on already existing database. So we're going to go ahead and upgrade right now. So just a little bit of organization tips here. This is your solution file here. This is the package that tells Visual Studio what projects are integrated into this particular solution. So this level is our project, okay? And what we're going to do here is just right click and go to Manage Nuget Packages, okay? And from here we're going to have a few selections of choices to upgrade. This one we're going to upgrade Entity Framework 6. It will probably be at the top of your list. If it's not, you just have to search for it in this area here. Search online, just type Entity Framework. And in particular, we're going to look for version 6.11 in this case. Now, the reason we're doing this is because we're using Visual Studio Professional 2012. So obviously the templates were designed with Entity Framework 5.00 in mind. So we're going to upgrade this. And Entity Framework Power Tools also uses Entity Framework 6 to run. So we have to upgrade our projects. Okay, now that we've installed that, we can simply go to the Models folder I want you to right click on the models folder and click add. And there's a few ways to do this. You could go to ADO.NET Entity Data Model, but I'm going to guide us through the full process so that everybody understands right from the very beginning. So we click on Visual C# again, data templates this time. The other one was web templates before. We click on ADO.NET Entity Data Model, and our name is going to be Data Context. Got to spell things right. There we go. And click Add. Now here we have a few selections here. In this case, we're going to use Code First from Database, and that comes with Entity Framework Power Tools. And we click on the Next button. From here, we select our connection strings. In this case, we're going to select default connection, and that comes from our web.config file. We reviewed this section here a couple of minutes ago. This will also use a connection setting in our web config, and it's going to create a new one based on the settings that we use in default connection. And it's good to keep them separate so that you know which one uses what database. Sometimes they're using the same database, but it's good to know where your models come from and where your user authentication comes from. Okay. Now, one thing that's very important to note is this little checkbox here, pluralize or singularize generated object names. And this is a very helpful feature because sometimes databases are not pluralized. In other words, what that indicates is that if I have a user profile, that indicates one person. If I have user profiles, that would indicate that I have a collection of user profile objects. So when we create our database models from this, I wanted to produce a name that is a little bit more indicative of what the objects are. So this will create a table. In this case, it's going to create one called user profiles with an S at the end. Okay, so it'll pluralize the names. Some of these Microsoft's tools here do not pluralize. I'm not really sure why, but it's not a big deal nonetheless. It will still function the way it needs to be. And what we're going to do is select all of the tables because I want to pull everything in so I can manage those tables the way I like to do it. We'll click Finish here, and that'll very quickly create our database models and our database context. Now the context is just what it is that it's telling a story about all the data that is in our project. Database or data context, that's our file that we created, inherits an object called DB context, which handles data very nicely in MVC applications, and not necessarily just MVC applications, but it can be used for a variety of other purposes and makes using data quite quick and easy. You'll notice this here, the base is pointing to a connection string, and it gives a name of data context. That's pointing to our web.config, which has now been modified to include data context. The connection string here is slightly different than the one that's above. You can keep it with the default information, or you can make it the same. We're not going to worry too much about connection strings right now and the details of connection strings. Okay, let's go back to our data context. We'll just talk about the tables. This was the table that we were talking about earlier, user profile. It is now called user profiles. You'll notice that it was pluralized. Okay, these ones were not pluralized. Again, I'm not too sure why, but again, it's not that much, not very important to note that. The name of the collection is called a DB set. Okay, and that's kind of like a list or collection object. It just puts everything into a big array and allows us to search and interact with the data in a specific way. We can add, edit, delete items from the database very easily. And again, that's a very helpful feature. It's something that would have taken a lot of lines of code before to do, and we can interact with the data quite nicely. Now, if I look into the Server Explorer here, and I go into our data context, under data connections, I want to see, in particular, what the tables look like. Okay, there are specific properties, and we're going to focus on user profile right now. The first property is user ID, and the second one is username. Now, if I go to right-click here and show table data, I'm going to see the data that I entered when I signed in. And what we used signed in was test user. And then I signed in. What it did when I signed in is it created a user ID for me. Right now, I'm user 1. But if I added more data to this table or registered more users, it just adds more users to this table. So why don't we go ahead and do that right now. Okay. Now, what it's got here is an issue with the tables that we've used before.